Everyone thinks they live in the most interesting and exciting and dramatic political times. I may have told this story at McGill before, but I always tell the tale of I once worked in Fianna Fáil headquarters. The last project I did for the party was as an advanced tour planner for Mary McAleese's election in the autumn of 1997. And we brought into the campaign headquarters, which we established for that contest, about half a dozen postgrads out of UCD and Trinity. Some of them involved in history and studying the presidency, some of them generally politically active and useful as kind of a backup in the headquarters operation. And they found it incredible. The week or 10 days in the middle of that election campaign, where firstly Mary McAleese, of course, surprised by beating Albert Reynolds for the nomination in circumstances that still remain to be explained, shall we say. Secondly, there was the leak of the Department of Foreign Affairs memo, not by the Department of Foreign Affairs, I should emphasise, but a leak of the memo that suggested, that was used by Mary McAleese's opponents to suggest that she was close to Sinn Féin, at a time when being close to Sinn Féin was a controversial thing to be. And then there was a standoff, essentially, between Mary McAleese and the media. There was a series of testy interviews, a series of unfair interviews. There was a day-long fall tour around one of the Aran Islands where the media and the candidate didn't talk at all, and that culminated on the Sunday night with a tussle, physical tussle, on the lobby of a hotel in Galway between Noel Dempsey and Jim Fahey, the RT correspondent, as he tried to get access to the candidate. And these 6 postgrads on the Monday morning said, "This must be the most incredible election or presidential election campaign ever." And I used to say, you should have been here 7 years ago for Lenihan v. Robinson. When I first got involved in politics in the early 80s, I used to say to my dad that, 4 heaves against Charlie in 5 years, 3 different elections in 18 months. This must be the most incredible political time ever. He used to say, you should have been around for the arms crisis. However, even I have to accept that as we sit now, 6 months after the 2011 election, we are at perhaps the most dramatic political times ever in Irish history. What I want to caution is it would be wrong to assume that it is all of a sudden going to get dull and boring. One of the arguments I want to suggest to you today is the underlying conditions for political volatility in this country persist. A week is a hell of a long time in politics. It irritates me when I'm asked on radio or television or whatever to take a guess at what might happen in the next week or two of politics, because a week is an awful long time in politics. Yeah, come to McGill and Joe Mulholland wants you to talk about forever. It's not good enough to talk in terms of months, electoral cycles or years, but Joe Mulholland says forever. Now, forever is an incredibly long time, and an incredibly long time in politics. So I'm not going to talk about forever. I want to say something very briefly about the recent past. I don't want to need to go through the details of what happened in the 2011 election, because Frank and Avril have covered the details for you, fairly dramatic, except one other footnote, which is, of course, as well as the transformation in Fine Gael and Labour's positioning in the electoral system, the emergence of a large chunk of independents was significant. The re-emergence of Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin emerged as a significant force in this election, which they didn't even manage to do at the height of the peace process years. And, of course, the Greens were eliminated for the Dáil, probably for the foreseeable future, at least. So that's the shake-up of the landscape. That's the landscape that exists. It is certainly, for the time being, not forever, but for the time being, a changed political landscape. What's still not clear is what new landscape there will be. What is a bit clearer, but we still can't be certain about, is what happened almost 6 months ago in the election and why it happened. Before taking my initial stab, though, at why I think the landscape changed so dramatically in the election, I want to dispel one notion, which apparently is going around in private Fine Gael meetings. Frank probably doesn't get into it there and hasn't got into it here. And this is this notion that Fine Gael 2.5 years ago sat down and wrote down this brilliant electoral strategy plan that would destroy Fianna Fáil. It's a classic case of Fine Gael claiming something for which Fianna Fáil is entirely responsible. Kevin Rafter repeats some of this in what is an otherwise, I have to emphasise, a fascinating book, both in its account of Enda Kenny's background and of Fine Gael's recent history. His book is entitled How Fine Gael Made History, or subtitled How Fine Gael Made History. Fine Gael did not make this history. Fianna Fáil did. Fine Gael didn't destroy the Fianna Fáil support base, Fianna Fáil self-destructed. Enda Kenny and his team deserve considerable credit for saving their party from extinction after the 2002 election and for effecting sufficient recovery in the 2007 election to enable it to be the primary beneficiary, though not the sole beneficiary, of Fianna Fáil's collapse. The February 2011 election was, as Brian Hayes inelegantly but accurately put it, it was about the other parties fighting over the Fianna Fáil carcass. In that fight, Fine Gael proved very good carnivores. While they may have hunted well, they did not kill the beast. The death for Fianna Fáil was by political suicide. It is the Fianna Fáil leadership and strategists who deserve to be given the lion's share of credit for destroying their party's once legendary electoral standing. It is the Fianna Fáil leaders of recent times who carry much, probably most, of the responsibility for the banking, fiscal and unemployment crisis which hit this country with particular force in the mid of 2008. In a few short years, they shattered the reputation for economic competence which their party had enjoyed since the last decade. The collapse of Fianna Fáil was due, first and foremost, to the economic crisis and the blame which attached to the party for it. When it comes to the relationship between economic and political developments, I follow the teachings of Karl Marx and James Carville. Economics is always the key determinant of political outcomes. It is the economy stupid. The Irish economy was speeding at the time the international economic road conditions changed. And it accelerated as the bends got sharper. As the party in government at the wheel when the resultant crash occurred, Fianna Fáil was and was seen to be responsible. Any hope which Fianna Fáil might have had of restoring even some of its standing with the electorate by doing a quality repair job on the fiscal and banking damage were always slim. They dissipated entirely when the IMF arrived with its EC and ECB partners to fund and manage Ireland's fiscal affairs. Secondly, just when their country and their party most needed strong political leadership, Fianna Fáil's leadership team was just not up to it. They were tired and institutionalised by years of government. They were overly partisan, intolerant of alternative viewpoints, and incapable of communicating to a people increasingly traumatised by bad economic news. Over the course of the economic crisis, the Cowan-led cabinet was weak. For the latter months, it was just dysfunctional. The relationship between the coalition partners had broken down. The Greens would have struggled to borrow Seamus Brennan's phrase, the Greens would have struggled to play hurling at championship level, even in fair weather. But as the environment deteriorated economically, got worse and worse, they simply buckled. They were not alone in so doing. Most of their Fianna Fáil colleagues were similarly overwhelmed. Traumatised, battered, depleted and politically bruised, they collapsed. Then, in a further kick to the supporters who had stayed with them, many Fianna Fáil ministers simply walked off the pitch before the result was declared at the final whistle. Thirdly, over the more medium term, in the last decade and a half in particular, the recent Fianna Fáil leadership squandered their political heritage. They firstly neglected their party organisation and then actively disorganised it so that it would not get in the way of the increasingly personalised and professionalised paid-for machines that they had established in their constituencies. This political machinery, this personalised and professionalised political machinery, was expensive to run and generate. It generated too many opportunities for questionable fundraising and at times a dangerous mixing of personal and political resources. In reality, Fianna Fáil never managed to put in place in urbanised and suburbanised Ireland an organisational model akin to the successful parish common network which Lemass and others built across rural Ireland. This organisation was apparent when I worked in Fianna Fáil headquarters myself about 20 years ago. It intensified as Ireland underwent dramatic demographic change during the Celtic Tiger years, but it was masked by the extraordinary appeal both to urban and rural voters of Bertie Ahern, and masked also by the electoral credit Fianna Fáil attached from the boom. When I worked in headquarters in the late 80s, beginning of the 1990s, the big perennial problem was, what are we going to do about Dublin? We could never find an organisational model that would gather in a geographically specific way to the depleting party activist base in the capital. One idea that ultimately was settled on by Seamus Brennan, as he was then the party's national director of organisation, was that we would seek to replicate the ward manager system that Bertie had implemented in Dublin Central, the kind of Drumcondra mafia. What certainly was apparent to me, but wasn't said very publicly by Fianna Fáil at the time, was that that was not the mass volunteer political active organisation it was assumed to be. It was a cash-rich organisation. If the one thing we've learned from the testimony of the tribunals, it may not be reflected in the tribunal report ultimately, but it's very well catalogued in a book by Shane Coleman and Mike Clifford, is the sheer volume of money that flowed through the Dublin Central organisation. I've argued myself that in a sense Bertie's sin was that he gathered all that money and spent it on politics, and very little of it of himself. That's what the obsession was. But someday I'm hoping political scientists will sit down and do a detailed analysis of the sheer volume of money that was involved in the Dublin Central organisation and the extent to which, over the last 20 years or so, Fianna Fáil headquarters one time used to discourage and clamp down on that personalised and money-rich political organisation. Ultimately, it ended up proactively encouraging it to cover for its organisational deficit. And in its final phases, the very party leader himself was at the pinnacle of that personalised political operation. In trying to communicate the scale of impact which the collapse of Fianna Fáil had in the Irish political marketplace to a collection of public relations and marketing people recently, I said to them, imagine if Guinness suddenly became undrinkable. Imagine if tens of thousands of loyal drinkers of the black stuff just couldn't stand the taste of it anymore. That's what it's akin to. It's akin to the collapse of the big, dominant tradition name. And, you know, Fine Gael claiming all the credit for it is a bit like the marketing manager of Murphy's patting himself on the back for the flood of new customers he gets the day that happened. You've got to see it at that scale. Kevin Rafter in his book again uses the analogy of brands. He says, you know, Yahoo has replaced Google, Pepsi has replaced Coca-Cola, Fine Gael has replaced Fianna Fáil. And that's a useful analogy, provided you factor in that it's really a scenario where, you know, where Coca-Cola just suddenly lost all its taste. Yeah, then Pepsi would replace it. Or if Google suddenly started getting its search results wrong, then Yahoo would become the dominant search engine. All of the tremors we have witnessed in the Irish political landscape in this election and the aftershocks which may yet follow are due to the tectonic shifts caused by the collapse of Fianna Fáil. If we must be tentative about assessing the reasons for the recent political collapse, we of course must be even more cautious predicting the future. One thing is clear, as I said, the recent election has transformed the Irish party system for the time being. But I think there are two interrelated questions which are worth asking at this stage. The first one is, as I said, is the volatility in the Irish political system over? And the answer has to be no. Why? Because the underlying conditions that gave rise to this volatility persist. Our economic crisis is not over. Our economic trauma is not over. The people and the political system are taking a breather. They're taking a breathing space. The change of government has had a positive effect in calming the public mood. The new government is doing all the largely superficial things that the country wants. They're changing car transport systems. They're having a lash at the banks and the judges and the semi-state bosses. All that's what the public want to hear, and they are communicating it better and doing it, in Kenny's case again last night, with some energy and optimism. But the really tough decisions have yet to come. The next phase, and it's only the first of 3 phases, of spending cuts and income adjustments has yet to arrive. I think there's a failure to appreciate that the Irish, Athens is written, Dublin is quieter than Athens. The Irish do their writing in the ballot box. But it would be naive to assume that there isn't still the potential for dramatic and perhaps dangerous political volatility in Ireland, even if the European situation settles down, and there's no guarantee it will. The volatility in Ireland may persist. And I've instanced before, and I think it's worth making the point again to this particular forum, of two segments of our society that are particularly affected by the economic crisis and that have, in a sense, that their angst is impacting in the political system. There were tens and tens of thousands of largely males working in the construction industry in this country, both skilled and unskilled. And they are gradually became unemployed across 2008 and 2009, and it's now they are now realizing, and it's dawning on them, they don't see pathways back to work. They don't see pathways back. You can talk all you like about retraining, or you can talk all you like about, some of them will be employed in retrofitting houses for environmental grants or whatever. But just think about it. You could be talking something in the region of 90 to 100,000, largely male, former construction workers, skilled and unskilled. Nowadays I occasionally get to sit at dinners and meetings like this beside economists. One time, when asked to sit beside economists, you kind of felt you drew the short straw. But now everybody wants to sit beside the economists because they have the interesting things to say. And I've said to them, that some of the men I talk about are relations and neighbours of mine, and I've said to them, where is the pathway back to work for these men? And their answer is, there isn't one. And we don't need them, because we're going to have a super-duper knowledge-based, export-led economy. And in societal terms, you can't leave that chunk of population parked outside of the employment market. In political terms, it is dynamite. Breakfast roll man was significant in political terms at the height of the construction boom. Now, as long-term unemployed, he's as likely, in my view, to have a significant impact in the political system. That volatility is real there. The second example, and you can think of different instances, I think there's a real struggle going on behind the doors of middle-class Ireland, behind their front doors. The husband is lying to the wife or vice versa about the state of their financial affairs. They have a general sense that they have managed to get through the last 24 months and kick the can down the road and manage the debt or the overhang of property debt or the credit card debt or whatever. They've just managed to squeeze from the increased tax that they have to pay in the form of income levies or otherwise. Now, when you come back to them in the autumn and tell them, as the government is going to have to do, that in some form, in form of household tax or direct or indirect tax or otherwise, they're going to have to find from after-tax income another 1,000 or 2,000 euros to contribute to the national public bailout, fiscal and otherwise, then I think they're at a stage politically where they're at their tether. And what they did in large numbers was give Fianna Fáil one hell of a kicking in the polling booths in February. And if this government can't satisfy them, or isn't the solution to their financial and political and social angst, then the reasons for that volatility will persist, and anything could still happen in Irish politics. If we've learned anything over the last 3 or 4 years, it's that anything could happen in Irish politics. Now, the last point I want to turn to, it seems it has dominated most of the session so far, because in many ways it is the sub-question that answers Joe's question about whether the landscape has changed forever, and that's whether Fianna Fáil will or will not survive in the current political environment. It fascinates me, as I suppose if I was on Mastermind, Fianna Fáil would be my specialist subject. I've just finished for Gillian Macmillan a book on the history of Fianna Fáil, which is to come out in the middle of October, and it covers all of the 100 years and only in passing the last couple of years, and it emphasises my point more than anything that there's nothing new in politics. A lot of this has happened before. But in answering the question whether Fianna Fáil will survive, my answer is probably not. Because when you look at it in a detached way, you have to see the odds are heavily weighed against it. There is no precedent in the modern Western democracy for a party making a recovery on the scale that Fianna Fáil now has to make if it's to come anything close to what it was before. The Fine Gael analogy of 2002 is not comparable. It's not comparable. The particular niche Fine Gael had persisted. Fine Gael wasn't half as far back as Fianna Fáil was from scratch, and Fine Gael had a bit more in terms of organisational, parliamentary and financial resources than Fianna Fáil currently has. Secondly, one of Micheál Martin's problems, and I agree with Avril, he has all of the necessary energy for the task. But one of his difficulties is he isn't building on a greenfield site. It would be easier to rebuild the organisation on a greenfield site, but his first task is a site clearing job. The debris in his way, organisational terms and otherwise, is immense. That's his first. It was a factor in the recent Shannon election. He faces it in Cummins and correlate throughout the country. Literally, there's a lot of people, the demographic and age profile and otherwise of his party structure is wrong. There's debris in the way as part of that rebuilding process. And then the site he's seeking to build on is toxic. The site he's seeking to build on is simply toxic. The public anger at Fianna Fáil was and still is intense, and I see no sign that it will abate in the short term. The other difficulty is, and there's a view among some of Fianna Fáil, that well, if we do a competent parliamentary job, then this government will either break up or mess up, or fall out with the people. People will fall out with it over the course of 5 years, and the public will come back, flock back. The voters will flock back to Fianna Fáil. I could tell you a dozen 7 or 8 similar instances from the history of Fianna Fáil, from the research that I've done, where the approach was the same. Thrown out of government, they say, don't worry, the voters will come back to us, we just have to sit and wait. And the circumstances for the party are now extraordinarily worse. There's very little chance this government will break up, but even if this government did break up, in my view, in the ensuing election, Fine Gael would probably be elected on their own, which would have Labour on the opposition benches, which would further cannibalise more of Fianna Fáil's vote. If this government messes up, and that's always a possibility, particularly given the fiscal adjustments that are required, if this government messes up, then that's more likely to accrue to the benefit of Sinn Féin on the left. And here I disagree with Frank. I think if Fianna Fáil doesn't recover and this government becomes unpopular, as it inevitably perhaps will, then there is room in the Irish political system for a new party. Party systems that hold a vacuum. Once there's room in there, one will emerge. And I would be not surprised at all if at some point over the next 2 years a Fianna Fáil, a new political party emerged. In 10 years' time, as Avril says, we come back and gather here at Glenties to address the nature of the political landscape. What state will Fianna Fáil? I think Avril will be back here because I think she has all the political skills necessary to have a successful political career, but I'm not necessarily convinced, and on balance I don't think she will be back as a Fianna Fáil parliamentarian. There are 5 scenarios. There are 5 potential scenarios that could happen. The first one I call Fianna Fáil withers. Literally, it withers on the vine. It's already unsure about whether it can or is up to contesting the presidential election. It's likely to lose seats in the next local elections. There's every possibility it will lose further seats in the next general election or the general election after that. So if Fianna Fáil withers, Fianna Fáil could literally wither on the vine. Secondly, Fianna Fáil is subsumed into Fine Gael. That, again, you work this out over 5, 10 or 15 years on a 2 or 3 election cycle. You say, well, yes, as Frank says, they could be pushed into government together if Labour went across to the opposition benches after the next election, or just simply because it's withering at part of that process at some stage, it's subsumed into Fine Gael. The third, and this is a realistic possibility if you think of it in median terms, and that is that Fianna Fáil and Sinn Féin merge together in some form of popular front, initially around a transfer pact and then as an alternative government option. Sinn Féin, of course, has its own problem with political toxicity, but has affected some of its decontamination for Middle Ireland. The fourth scenario is that Fianna Fáil finds a niche and sustains itself as a small niche party in the political system. It's very hard, mind you, to find where that niche is, and that requires it to overcome the toxicity problem. The fifth option, and one I think if I was, God forbid, leading the party, I'd take a gamble on in about a year's time, is the News of the World option. Close the doors. Close the doors. Stand this thing down and re-phoenix in some shape or form as a new political entity or as part with others of a new political entity a while after that. Who knows? It's hard to interpret the past. It's impossible to predict the future.